Ready to ditch those picture-perfect postcards for a bit?
Mm-hmm.
We're diving deep into the Parisian suburbs today, the banlieue.
Yeah.
It's a side of Paris most folks don't really think about, huh?
It's true. Everyone loves those romantic Paris images.
Right. But the banlieue tells its own story. Fascinating one, actually, and often overlooked.
Totally agree.
So we're using Justinien Tribillon's book as our guide today, The Zone, an alternative history of Paris. It's not your typical history book, though.
Interesting.
Yeah, he ties in urban planning and even personal stories to make this part of Paris come alive.
Tribillon uses this concept of the zone to understand the city. It was a real place, like a no man's land outside the city walls back in the day.
Okay.
But it also represents something bigger. It's about the margins, the people and places existing just outside the mainstream.
I like that. So the zone is both a physical place and this idea.
Exactly.
Tribillon says you can't understand Paris without understanding the zone. Why was this area so crucial to how the suburbs developed?
Picture 19th century Paris. Booming city, right. But space, there's none to be had.
Right.
So just outside the city limits, in this fuzzy legal area, that's where you find the zone.
Huh.
Refuge for those pushed out of the city center, rag pickers, people working in the undesirable industries, anyone who didn't quite fit into Haussmann's grand vision.
Hold on. Who was Haussmann and why was he changing Paris?
Oh, Baron Haussmann. He was like Napoleon III super planner. Mid-1800s, he's overseeing these massive renovations.
Like what?
Tearing down those old, cramped neighborhoods to make way for the wide boulevards and grand buildings Paris is known for today.
I see.
Impressive as those changes might seem now, they displaced a ton of working-class Parisians, forced them to find housing elsewhere, often in the zone.
So the zone becomes this side effect of progress, a place where the so-called undesirable end up.
Exactly. And this is where the term slum starts being used, which is important.
How so?
Because it's a judgment, you know,
Sure.
about the people and the place.
It's like the word itself reinforces this idea that these communities are separate, outside what's considered normal.
Absolutely. And that had consequences. For example, there was this plague outbreak in the 1920s.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and the zone, especially the rag pickers, they were blamed for it, just fueled that image of the area being dangerous, unhealthy.
So they become scapegoats, basically.
Sadly, yes.
Yeah.
And it just reinforced those prejudices that were already there. Reminds me of how certain neighborhoods still get stereotyped today.
It's a pattern that seems to repeat itself through history.
Yeah, it does.
And speaking of repeating patterns, this leads us to the Green Belt. This ring of parks and green spaces, they were supposed to encircle Paris. Sounds lovely on the surface, right?
It does.
But
like a lot of urban planning, even with good intentions, you got to look at the motivations, and the consequences.
so there's more to this Green Belt idea that meets the eye.
Definitely. This greening was often tied to social hygiene. The idea that you could improve society by controlling the environment and by extension, the people in it.
Whoa, so you're saying even creating parks could be about social control?
It could. One of the big figures in the Greenbelt debate was Louis Doucet. His vision was all about creating a buffer between Paris and its suburbs, keep those undesirable elements at a distance,
So it wasn't just about fresh air and trees, it was about keeping those divisions in place.
Right.
Wow.
And it gets even more interesting because not everyone agreed with Doucet. Another planner, Eugene Hennard, he saw the Greenbelt as a chance for something different.
Really?
Yeah, he thought it could make a more integrated and equitable city. He actually criticized Doucet's plan, said it would make things worse.
Fascinating how these debates played out in the actual design of the city. Some wanted separation, some wanted integration. And those competing visions shaped Paris.
Yeah, and those tensions weren't limited to just urban planning. They were happening in politics, too, especially with the rise of the Red Belt. Those were the working-class suburbs around Paris, and they became strongholds for the Communist Party.
Ah, the Red Belt. It just sounds like working-class solidarity. How did that identity emerge? And how did it shape the banlieue?
It really took off during the 1924 elections in France. The Communist Party got a surprising amount of support.
Really?
Yeah, particularly in the suburbs around Paris. This prominent communist, Paul Vaillant-Couturier, he described it as a red belt encircling the city.
Catchy phrase, but it meant a real shift in how those suburbs saw themselves politically, huh?
Exactly. The Communist Party, They tapped into the frustrations of those working-class communities. Many felt forgotten in all the changes happening in Paris proper.
Yeah.
They wanted workers' rights, better housing, just a fairer system.
And this wasn't just some abstract political movement, was it? Tribillon connects this to his own family, talking about his mother growing up in Ivry-sur-Seine, a suburb that was really into the Communist Party.
It just shows you how these big historical forces play out in regular people's lives. You know, the planners making decisions, the political movements, they leave their mark on a place and everyone in it.
It's true. It's amazing how those historical threads, the zone, the green belt, even the red belt, all connect to shape the Parisian suburbs.
They really do. And to understand the banlieue today, you got to factor in the boulevard périphérique.
Yes, the périphérique. That ring road everyone loves to hate.
Right.
Most people just think traffic nightmare, but Tribillon sees it as something more.
Way more. See, the périphérique, it comes from this technocratic mindset in France, especially during the Vichy regime.
Okay.
This belief that experts with technology could fix any social problem,
Interesting.
often ignoring what the people living in those spaces actually needed or wanted.
So the périphérique, this huge project, it was about imposing order on Paris and its suburbs, making them fit some plan.
In a way, yeah. And it's funny because at first, the périphérique was supposed to be part of that green belt we talked about.
Wait, seriously. The périphérique as a parkway. Hard to imagine when you're stuck on it in traffic.
Tell me about it. The original idea was this tree-lined road, almost scenic.
Huh.
But as things progressed, the technocrats took over and, well, it became something else entirely.
And that shift, green to concrete, it didn't impact everyone equally, I'm guessing.
Sadly, no. Tribillon uses the example of Lucie Lapuzanska and her family.
Why happened?
They lived in this working-class neighborhood right by the périphérique. Their story really shows how these big urban projects, they don't affect everyone the same.
So what was it like for them?
Their neighborhood got all the bad stuff, basically. Noise, pollution, feeling cut off from the rest of the city. What's worse, wealthier areas got noise barriers, other perks.
While these families dealt with the downsides.
Exactly. Classic example of how urban planning, even if it seems neutral, can actually make inequality worse. And it often hits those already struggling the hardest. Which leads us to another complex layer. France's colonial past. Tribillon argues it's still shaping the city today, especially in the banlieue's makeup.
He uses the 1931 colonial exhibition that was held in the Bois de Vincennes as an example, right?
Yeah.
What was the significance of that event? What does it have to do with the suburbs?
On the surface, the exhibition was this big spectacle showing off French colonialism, look at our achievements kind of thing.
Right.
But underneath, it was all about French superiority, you know, this idea that they were meant to rule.
How did that actually show itself, though?
You see it in the architecture, how they designed the pavilions for the different colonies. There's this implied ranking. France on top, of course. And it wasn't just theoretical, this belief in their culture being better, it's how they treated colonial subjects, both in the colonies themselves and back in France.
And here's where the link to the banlieue comes in.
Yeah.
After World War II, France needed workers. They turned to their former colonies.
Exactly. Huge influx of immigrants, especially from Algeria. Many ended up in the Parisian suburbs.
Making a new life,
But facing discrimination, few opportunities, they got stuck in bad housing, the bidonvilles, overcrowded hotels, you name it.
Tribillon talks about the Nanterre bidonville, right? Thousands of Algerian immigrants live there.
Yeah, it's a rough reminder of what they dealt with.
Poverty, lack of even basic services, the constant fear of being evicted.
And that social hygiene idea pops up again, too.
Mm.
The bidonvilles, they were seen as ugly, places of disease and unrest, just fueled the prejudice even more.
It's like these communities were trapped. They came to escape hardship, but ended up in a place with different hardships.
Tragic, isn't it? Highlights the legacy of colonialism. These weren't one-off things. They were part of a system to exploit, to marginalize.
Tribillon does a good job of sharing personal stories from that time, doesn't he?
He does. He includes excerpts from this woman, Monique Herveau's diary. She lived in the Nanterre bidonville. Yeah, and reading her experiences, the hardships, it's heartbreaking. No sanitation, constant threat of illness, just trying to keep their families afloat.
He mentions one girl, Fatiha. She saw awful violence back in Algeria before even arriving in France. You really feel the weight of what they went through, you know, but also their strength.
That's amazing, the resilience. But it also shows how the system failed them. They deserved dignity, support, and didn't get it. And it's sad because even today, some of those patterns of exclusion, they haven't gone away.
It's like we see echoes of the past in how people talk about the Banlieue now. Still that fear, that othering.
Exactly, like this debate about calling certain suburbs ghettos. Such a loaded term. Tribillon's careful about it.
He doesn't shy away from the problems,
But he doesn't want to use language that just makes the stigma worse.
Right.
He's really clear that these areas are more complex than like what you see on the news. Those no-go zone stories, that's not the whole picture.
He says even with the poverty, the lack of jobs, the lack of opportunity, real things, the Banlieue is also resilient, creative.
Yeah.
There's a strong sense of community.
Yeah, he wants people to see past those simple narratives.
Yeah.
To see how vibrant these communities are. He uses the example of the pandemic, actually.
Oh, interesting.
As awful as COVID was, it showed the strength and solidarity in the Banlieue. They were hit hard, you know?
Yeah.
Higher infection rates, not enough health care, economic hardship. But they came together, supported each other.
Oh, what are they doing?
Food banks, childcare for essential workers, finding ways to connect even with lockdowns. They found a way.
It makes you think. Even facing all that, these communities, they're not defined by their struggles alone.
Yeah.
There's this spirit
Right.
that doesn't get enough attention. So what now? What happens next for the Parisian Banlieue?
Tribillon doesn't have all the answers, but he does leave you with hope. Things can change, but we have to face those challenges head on.
He ends on the Helmer Zook, right?
He does. That tragic death, the protests, it all sparked this conversation about police brutality and racial injustice in France, which
It's still so relevant.
it is, and he connects it directly back to everything we've been talking about. The marginalization, the discrimination that the Banlieue has faced for so long.
It's a reminder that these aren't just isolated incidents. These problems are rooted in racism, inequality, colonialism's legacy.
Yeah, and we all have to do something. We have to engage with these issues.
It's on us to challenge our own assumptions, to listen to the people who've been pushed aside, to work for a better, fairer system for everyone. So what can our listeners take away from all of this, from this dive into the history of the Parisian suburbs?
The Parisian story, I zest the story of its suburbs. You can't have one without the other.
The Banlieue, even with its complexities, it's part of what makes Paris, Paris.
And the struggles they face, they're connected to bigger problems. We can't ignore that.
It's about understanding, not imposing our own ideas from the outside. We need to listen to the Banlieue, support their initiatives, work together.
Exactly.
It's been quite a journey. Exploring the Banlieue from those forgotten zones to the suburbs as they are now. We hope this challenged how you see things, that you look past those postcard images and you see the beauty and the struggles, the resilience.
And the hope.
Yes, the hope that exists in these places most people misunderstand.
And remember, the story isn't over. We're all part of writing the next chapter.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.
It's not